Nurses of Reddit, what is the most haunting last words patients have said to you? When I was 19 I was working in a lab at a hospital as a phleb and I was really good at drawing blood. Was called to ER to draw blood from a 12-year-old at around 7 AM. He had spider web looking veins all over his body except hands, feet and above the neck. Drew blood. No big deal. Called back again to draw a second sample. Everything was purple. He looked up at me and asked me if he could have some water. I looked at the attending and he shook his head no and then mouthed, "We are about to intubate." He grabs my hand and 2 seconds later he went into arrest. His parents were outside the room looking in through glass. Mom was bawling. Dad was bawling. Everyone did chest compressions for what seemed like 45 minutes. He died. Last thing he said to anyone was to ask for some water. From me. I left. Kept my composure. Got to a private hallway and started bawling. Entire way back to our office. Walked into my boss's office and said I quit. Turns out kid had bacterial meningitis. Edit. Thanks to the 10 people who were so anxious to correct someone's spelling that they didn't notice the previous mentions of it. That's so sad. Poor kid. Do you know how he caught it? If you had given him water, he would have gone into arrest anyway. And then you'd have felt like it was your fault for giving him water when he was NPO. You did good. Don't worry about it. My mom was sent home from the hospital because she was nearing the end and wanted to be home. The last few days she was heavily medicated and didn't really communicate at all. On Sunday she took off her oxygen mask and said she was going to die tomorrow. She put her mask back on and didn't talk anymore. I called out of work. That was an odd call to make, and called the family. Her twin drove 4 hours to be there on Monday. She died Monday evening with her whole family at her side. It has been 4 years and it still weirds me out. My little brother had cancer decades ago when he was a teenager. He was having a bit of a rough spell one particular week, which didn't alarm us too much because he had been through several such spells and always pulled through just fine. Chemo is gnarly. One morning he woke up, asked my mom to call me, and then went back to sleep. That was the last thing he ever said. When my mom called, I knew what was happening before I even answered the phone. My dad, a truck driver, was like 6 hours away when we called him. He hauled us back home as fast as possible and arrived just before my brother passed. Even though my brother was pretty much in a coma, he waited to go until after my dad got home. After dad graduated medical school he was a resident in an inner city emergency department. One night rescue brought in a guy the department knew of, major health issues, major addiction issues, and a real scumbag to boot. When rescue found him he'd been laying in his own filth for days. His chest x-ray was lit up like a Christmas tree with pneumonia, as my dad tells it. His heart was in even worse shape. Even while laid up in bed this guy still found time to harass the nurses, throw out every name in the book. Real nice dude. So my dad was at the nurse's station when he notices an irregular rhythm on this guy's heart monitor. When dad tells it he likes to make a repeating M shape with his finger. He was going into ventricular tachycardia. Not a great sign. So he headed over. My dad stood in the doorway and said, "Hey buddy, how do you feel?" And the guy looked him in the face and yelled, "With my hands, you jerk off." And then he died. Is it really bad that I laughed at the thing that the patient said before death? I didn't want to die, looking straight at me as blood poured out of their mouth from esophageal varices that had ruptured, a literal death sentence, as the patient knew well. I still remember the color of their eyes. Not a nurse but I'm a therapist at a hospital. Had a patient basically in his end stage of life tell me, "I can't even spend my own money." Not sure why this hit me so hard but it stuck with me. Hell, this one hit me hard because it's pretty accurate. Obligatory not a nurse but. My great uncle's last words were about having to catch the train. My grandpa's last words were about getting on the ship. My dad's last words were about making his flight. I've told everyone I've ever dated to wake me the fuck up if I ever start talking in my sleep about transportation. So of our generation you'll likely be saying something like, "About to call the Uber." Not a nurse but we had a guy who was in a major MVA. His left arm was severed above the elbow and he was circling the drain. His blood pressure was tanking. House was starting to fade and he asked me about his dog that had been in the vehicle with him. Asked me if his dog was okay. I didn't really answer him, as the dog was dead and I didn't want to put him in any more distress than he was already in. We landed a helicopter and I shit you not we were about 30 seconds from loading him into the helicopter when he coded. If you know anything about traumatic CPRs, there is virtually no chance that they will survive, especially without deficits. Maybe like a 1-2% chance, I can't remember the exact number. Anyway, we worked him, got him loaded back into the ambulance and made the 35-minute plus transport to the trauma center through rush hour traffic. Got him into the trauma bay. The DR said they were going to do one more round and if there was no improvement they were going to call it, which they did. So the last thing the guy said was make sure my dog's okay. Ultimately he died from internal hemorrhaging, which there's nothing we could really do in the pre-hospital setting for him. If we had TXA or something like that we could have used it, but it's a toss-up whether it would have helped this guy at the point he was at. Not a nurse, but the last words my mother told me before she died was I feel a lot better. She had been battling breast cancer and doing chemotherapy the last couple months. Still makes me cry. Actual nurse here. The superstition is that patients will feel a sense of impending doom when they are going to die. Sometimes, everything looks great on paper, then they say I think I'm gonna die and then 12 hours later they are lifeless. The first time this happened to me, it was at the end of a crazy 12-hour shift where my patient had gotten progressively worse, from mildly sick to dead. When I walked on that evening, he looked me in the eye and told me he was dying. He was just on a touch of blood pressure and dialysis support. We did all the scans, all the lab work, but nothing could explain why he was tanking so fast. And then right before he died 12 hours later, he grabbed my hand, looked me in the eye, and said I told you so. Has happened a few other times, but that was the creepiest. Not the very last words, but I found them quite unsettling. A few years ago my best friend lost her fight with cancer. Her mother had also died of cancer when my friend was 21. I helped care for my friend right to the end so she could be home instead of in hospital or hospice, and I was there when she died. About an hour or two before that, she started getting very agitated and asking for some very specific things, some buttons of a certain color, a particular item of clothing, a few other things. Her sister realized that she was asking for things her mother had been wearing or had in the room when she died and got very upset and told her that she didn't need them, it was okay without them. My friend looked at her and said, "Don't worry, Mum's telling me how to die." She was seeing her long deceased mother and thought she needed the same setting before she could die. I assumed that it was a hallucination. She'd been having them for a couple of days at that point after her pain meds were increased. But it was very unnerving to witness and seemed different to the other hallucinations she'd been having. Maybe she really did see her mother. That moment certainly brought me closer to believing there might be an afterlife than religion ever did. A patient was repeatedly saying, "Where is my dog? I want to see my dog, plus my dog is home alone," and the guy was dead 2 hours later. Made me feel sad for some reason. Not a nurse, but had a kid who was just standing on a sidewalk in a bad neighborhood. Drive-by shooting, which of course missed their targets and hit a kid and an older gentleman. Older guy was DOA, kid got hit in the arm once and chest twice, barely clinging to life. Only thing we ever heard him say before he went unconscious was how much pain he was in and that he didn't want to die, which a few minutes later happened. I've never worked so hard on a PT before or since. Partner quit the next day and I'm still going 13 years later. Had an elderly woman who was intubated and sedated. When you have a patient who is sedated, you turn down their sedation and try to wake them up, kind of, every morning to test their readiness to come off the ventilator. She never really woke up. Her adult son was distraught. He was her next of kin, and he had to decide if he was going to take her off the ventilator or keep trying. He agreed to take her off the vent the next day. I was in her room later that day, and I was chatting with her like she could hear me. When suddenly, she responded. She made a purposeful nod. I was startled to say the least. I took her hand and tried to figure out how to explain to her what was happening. She was dying of cancer, she was failing her wings, and we planned to take her off the vent tomorrow to die with her son by her side. And I asked, "Is that okay?" She nodded. "Do you want me to call your son and tell you that you love him?" She nodded. I wish I could remember what we talked about next. Did I pray with her? Did I comfort her? I don't remember. But I do remember calling her son and telling him that his mom knew she was ready and that she loved him. Edit. Thanks for the gold, kind stranger. I worked as a CNA in a nursing home for 2 years when I was in nursing school. We had patients on hospice frequently, most of them at the end just peacefully slipped away. We had one gentleman who was always just, if he wasn't trying to grab at my behind he was yelling at me over something I couldn't help, like the lights in the hallway or his roommate snoring. He used to change his TV every time I came in his room so we could watch Shark Week and trashy reality shows. He got a very bad diagnosis and went downhill really fast over the course of a week or so, and we called his family. They were on their way but they wouldn't be there for a while, so I stayed with him the first night that we all kind of knew he didn't have much longer. He was panicking. He wouldn't settle down. He kept saying, "Help me," and there was nothing I could do. I just held his hand and told him over and over he wasn't alone. He was like that for 2 or 3 days before he slipped into a coma. It still breaks my heart. I think about him looking at me that way and frantically asking for help, then telling me he loved me, then asking for help again. I wish there was something I could have done. I've seen death plenty of times, but I've never seen that before or since. I hope I never have to. I have had several elderly patients tell me their long dead relative will be coming by to get them at a specific time. Every single patient that has told me that has died at the exact time the patient said they would. I've also learned to take note when a patient said he or she is going home tomorrow, especially when you know that patient isn't going home tomorrow. Saddest, my favorite patient I had been seeing for years, she was in the end stages of liver failure. One morning she didn't recognize me. This is a patient who knows me well. She knew my child's name, my dog's name, we have a very long history. I cried when I saw her labs. She died very quickly and all I could do was hold her husband's hand and pray for her. It was so sad. She was only 40, had 2 young children. I see her husband every once in a while in town. He seems so sad every time I see him.